She gave up her night's wages to protect strangers with a gun pointed at her chest. The billionaire who witnessed it decided to give her something far greater in return. Alexander Sterling moved through the night air with a coat collar pulled high and his steps quick but unhurried, the sort of pace that made him blend rather than stand out. The neon sign of the diner cast a red glow across the wet pavement, and he paused for a moment to look at it, a reminder of how far he had come and how much he now owned. Sterling Global had built towers of steel, fleets of jets, and chains of restaurants, but tonight none of that mattered. At 45, with $10 billion tied to his name, he was stepping into one of his own properties dressed like a man with nothing in his pockets. His jeans were loose at the knees, his shirt faded, and the boots he wore were scuffed to the bone, a thrift store disguise that stripped away the armor of wealth. The glass doors parted, and he slipped inside, the warmth of frying oil and brewed coffee wrapping around him, the hum of conversation cutting off for a beat as people looked up, then quickly away. He was not expected here, not like this, and that suited him perfectly. He chose a booth near the window, a spot usually left for loners or drifters. The vinyl seat cracked with age. No one recognized him, not the couple in business attire sharing a late meal, not the group of college students bent over fries, not even the hostess who had barely looked at him before pointing to the empty booth. To them, he was just another man sliding into a seat, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes tired, a figure that carried no weight in the world. He let that feeling wash over him, the relief of being unseen. It was why he came to places like this, to shed the constant polish of boardrooms and headlines, to step away from assistants and advisors who mirrored his words back to him. He wanted to hear unguarded voices, to see how his empire lived and breathed at the lowest rung. He kept his hands folded on the table, fingers resting lightly, watching as waitresses moved between tables with practiced grace, balancing plates, refilling coffee, laughing politely at small talk. He was not here for the food, though he could order anything and never blink at the price. He was here for the truth, that hidden currency that no wealth could buy, the raw honesty that came when people believed no one important was listening. In this booth, in plain clothes, he could be invisible enough to find it. Alexander looked at the menu that had been slid onto his table, the laminated edges curling with use. The prices were nothing to him, yet he read them carefully as if they mattered, wanting to keep the disguise intact. His reflection in the glass showed not a billionaire but a tired man seeking warmth, and for a moment he almost believed it himself. The empty seat across from him remained untouched, a silent companion, a reminder that he was alone by choice, searching not for a meal but for something far rarer, something his fortune had never managed to purchase. Ella Marlowe approached the booth with a small notepad balanced in one hand and a pen tucked between her fingers, her steps quiet but sure even though her shoes were worn thin at the soles. She looked younger than 24, yet her eyes told another story, dark circles resting beneath them like faint bruises, the kind that came from long nights and early mornings. Her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, no effort at glamour, just the practicality of someone who had no time to waste. The diner's uniform hung on her frame, the fabric faded from years of washing, the stitching loose at the seams, but she carried it as though it were pressed silk. She placed a glass of water on the table with steady hands, offered a polite smile, and said in a calm voice that carried more warmth than the words themselves, "Good evening, sir. Welcome in. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Alexander looked at her carefully, not in the way a customer studies a waitress, but as a man who had trained himself to measure people in an instant. She was exhausted, that much was clear, but she did not let it seep into her tone. Her smile was tired yet real, a fragile bridge that connected her to every table she served, and in it he saw the outline of dignity. She did not glance at his clothes. She did not judge his plain jacket or the scuffed boots resting on the tile. She treated him the same way she might treat a man in a suit with a gold watch on his wrist. That small detail stirred something in him, for most people measured worth by surface, and yet she had chosen not to. He asked for coffee, nothing more, his voice gruff with the act of being ordinary. She nodded and jotted it down, her pen scratching the pad with brisk precision. Then she added, "I'll bring that right out," before moving on to the next table. He watched her walk away, the soles of her shoes nearly slipping on the linoleum, her shoulders squared against fatigue, her presence calm in the swirl of clattering plates and raised voices. The diner was busy, a steady hum of orders and chatter, but she moved through it like water around stones, unhurried yet efficient, giving each customer the sense of being noticed. When she returned with his coffee, setting it down with practiced care, Alexander thanked her quietly. She gave a faint smile, almost shy, and for a second he thought he saw the weight she carried beneath the mask of composure. It was in the way her hands lingered at her sides, as though they longed for rest, in the way her eyes softened when she thought no one was looking. He took a sip, bitter heat grounding him, and studied her once more. Ella Marlowe was more than tired. She was resilient, and in her poise he found the first hint of the truth he had come searching for. Alexander let the menu sit open in front of him as Ella stood waiting, her pen poised above the notepad, her face calm and unreadable, though her eyes carried a faint shine of weariness. The laminated pages listed simple meals for late-night diners, yet at the bottom, almost as a statement of pride, there was the extravagant seafood tower, a spectacle of lobster tails, oysters, crab claws, and prawns, arranged like a monument of indulgence. It was the sort of order that brought cameras out, the kind that men with expense accounts chose when they wanted to impress clients, the kind no one in thrift store clothes ever asked for. Alexander lifted his gaze from the menu to her steady expression, and in a voice that held no hesitation, he said, "I'll take the seafood tower, and bring me the vintage champagne, the Dom Perignon you list in the corner." Her hand moved smoothly across the page of her notepad, her pen gliding without pause. She did not blink at the price. She did not allow even the smallest flicker of doubt to cross her features. Most servers would have hesitated. Most would have shifted uncomfortably, asking for confirmation, wondering if the customer could pay. Ella did none of that. Her eyes remained clear, her posture straight, her voice steady as she replied, "Of course, sir. Excellent choice. I'll get that started right away." There was no sarcasm in her tone, no patronizing smile, only the kind of respect that treated every guest as though their order was valid, no matter what they looked like. Alexander felt a quiet stir of surprise in his chest. He had ordered the tower not out of hunger, but as a silent test, a way to measure the staff against the weight of pretense and judgment. He expected hesitation, a subtle glance at his boots, perhaps even a suggestion to choose something cheaper. Instead, he found himself facing someone who carried out her duty without prejudice. He nodded slightly as she stepped away, her shoes whispering across the floor, her figure weaving past other servers who laughed louder and moved faster, but none with her calm center. From his booth, he watched her head toward the kitchen, her pace neither hurried nor sluggish, just balanced, like someone who knew panic never solved anything. She spoke briefly to the bartender, gestured toward the wine list, and vanished into the swinging doors. Around him, the diner noise carried on, forks scraping plates, murmurs rising and falling, but Alexander's mind remained fixed on the young woman who had taken his extravagant order as though it were nothing unusual. She had not judged him, and in that lack of judgment he felt the rarest thing of all, genuine dignity. When she returned with the bottle resting carefully in her hands, she presented it like it belonged on his table, her fingers gentle as she opened it with practiced ease. The champagne fizzed softly into the glass, and she set it before him with a simple smile that did not waver. For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt the strange warmth of being treated not as a title or as a disguise, but simply as a man. The glass doors slammed open with a crash that silenced every fork and every laugh in the diner, and 3 masked men rushed inside with guns raised, their boots pounding against the tile like drums of war. For a heartbeat, the room froze, people caught between disbelief and terror. Then the first scream tore through the air and the sound multiplied. A chorus of panic as mothers pulled children under tables and couples dropped their phones and clutched each other. The men shouted for everyone to stay down, their voices raw and sharp, filling the space with a fear that felt alive, and every eye in the diner widened with helpless shock. Alexander did not move, his body pressed against the cracked vinyl seat, his hands folded as though he were still deciding on his meal. His disguise was his greatest shield, a plain jacket, scuffed boots, a face unremarkable in this moment of chaos. The robber's eyes swept the room but skipped over him, drawn instead to men with watches that glinted under the fluorescent lights, to women clutching handbags against their chests, to the safe in the back that only staff would know about. He sat like a ghost, watching the scene unfold with a calm that was not indifference, but a calculated stillness, the kind that had guided him through hostile boardrooms and cutthroat negotiations. Across the room, a plate shattered on the floor, the sound piercing the tense quiet, and one gun swung toward the noise, making a young man drop to his knees with his hands raised. The leader barked orders, his voice cracking with the thrill of control, demanding wallets, watches, phones, and the keys to the register. People scrambled to obey, shaking as they pushed their belongings toward the men, their fear spilling across the floor like broken glass. Alexander's eyes never left the waitress, Ella Marlowe, who stood near the counter with her hands slowly lifted, her face pale but her expression steady, her chest rising and falling in even breaths. She did not scream or beg, and she did not collapse into the panic around her. Instead, she moved carefully toward a family huddled in the corner, lowering her voice to soothe the crying child pressed against his mother's leg. Her calm spread like a ripple, quieting those nearest to her, her presence a fragile anchor in the storm. Alexander felt a flicker of respect burn inside him, stronger than any he had felt at an executive table. She was young, exhausted, worn down by long shifts, yet in the face of danger she carried herself with poise that even seasoned leaders failed to summon. The robbers were too busy gathering spoils to notice her steady influence, and Alexander remained invisible in his booth, his eyes cold, his mind calculating. He could feel the weight of the moment, the sharp line between fear and courage, and he knew he was witnessing something rare. In the chaos of a robbery, with screams still echoing through the air, the billionaire in disguise sat unseen while a tired waitress became the quiet center of strength. Ella's voice rose above the chaos not in volume, but in tone, steady and low, like the sound of water in a storm, guiding those near her with words that were simple, yet grounding. She crouched beside a family pressed into the corner, the mother shaking so hard that her hands could barely hold her son, the little boy's cries filling the air. "It's all right. You're safe here. Keep your head down," Ella whispered, brushing the boy's hair back from his damp forehead, her calm a direct contrast to the panic surging through the room. She placed one hand gently on the mother's trembling shoulder, urging her to take slow breaths, and with each word the sobs softened, The boy clutched tighter but grew quieter, his gaze drawn to Ella's face more than the guns flashing in the room. Other diners huddled behind overturned chairs and tables, their fear spilling out in muffled sobs and gasps. But Ella moved between them as though she had rehearsed for this moment all her life. She knelt beside two teenagers frozen under a booth, telling them in a calm voice to keep their eyes closed and think of someplace safe. Her hand steady as she slid their dropped phones out of sight so the robbers would not notice. She guided a trembling elderly couple down from their seats, her touch gentle yet firm, her tone so composed that they obeyed without question. Each time she spoke, Alexander saw the fear in the eyes of those around her lessen, not vanish but bend into something manageable, as though her courage lent them their own. The robbers were shouting, their words sharp and filled with threats, yet Ella's voice never wavered. She told the busboy, cowering near the counter, to lie flat. She urged another waitress to stay hidden and silent. She even looked directly at a man fumbling with his wallet and said softly, "It's okay. Give them what they ask. Don't resist." Her presence shifted the air, her calm cutting through the terror in a way that the robbers did not seem to notice, their attention locked on gathering valuables and intimidating those who hesitated. Alexander studied her with the eyes of a man used to measuring character under fire. He had seen executives fold under less pressure, had watched men of supposed power stammer and retreat when deals turned hostile. Yet here was a young woman with worn shoes and tired eyes, holding together a room full of frightened people with nothing but her voice. The disguise that made him invisible allowed him to see her clearly, unfiltered by status or expectation, and the sight stirred something within him that felt both familiar and rare, the recognition of true steadiness in a world built on pretense. The guns still pointed, the threats still echoed, the panic still simmered, but around Ella there was a pocket of control, fragile yet undeniable, and Alexander knew he was watching a kind of leadership money could never buy. The leader of the masked men strode to the center of the diner, his gun raised high, his voice raw and sharp as he barked out orders that seemed to crack against the walls. He shouted for wallets, for jewelry, for every guest to empty their pockets and drop their valuables onto the floor, his tone heavy with the thrill of power. The clatter of coins and the scrape of chairs followed, frightened hands trembling as rings were tugged off and watches pulled free, the air thick with panic as the robbers stalked between the tables. One of them shoved a young man back into his seat, snarling at him to move faster. Another swept his arm across a counter, sending plates and silverware crashing to the ground in a spray of noise that made the crowd shrink even smaller into their hiding places. Then came the demand that silenced even the sobs, the leader shouting for the manager. His voice cut through the room like a blade, sharp and cruel, and the staff froze where they stood, no one daring to answer. Alexander watched from his booth, his face still lowered, his disguise a shield that kept him hidden, his mind alive with calculation. He noted the way the waitresses glanced toward the back office, fear in their eyes, none of them willing to move. It was Ella who stepped forward, slow and steady, her hands raised where they could see them, her calm more striking in the middle of the chaos. She moved until she stood between the robbers and the nearest group of diners, her body a fragile wall against their guns, her voice soft but carrying across the room. "Take what you want, just don't hurt them," she said. And for a moment, even the leader's eyes flicked to her with surprise. It was not the plea of someone begging for her own life, but the measured request of someone shielding others, her tone so level that it almost sounded like reason. The mother, clutching her child near the booth, began to breathe easier. The elderly couple lowered their heads in relief, and Alexander felt a strange heat of admiration rise in his chest as he watched her face the danger no one else dared to. The leader sneered beneath his mask, waving his gun in her direction as if to remind her who was in control. But Ella did not flinch. She stood with her shoulders back, her eyes clear, her hands visible, offering no threat but no fear either. Around her the staff stayed frozen, the guests stayed silent, and the robbers gathered up the growing piles of cash and jewelry, but the heart of the room had shifted. In the storm of terror, one young waitress had planted her voice like an anchor, drawing the eyes of every trembling soul and even the quiet attention of the billionaire in disguise, who saw in her the courage money could never buy. The robber nearest to Ella turned with a sudden jerk. His mask tilted as his arm shot up, and the black barrel of his gun pressed through the air to point straight at her chest. Gasps broke from the tables, a sharp cry from somewhere in the back. But Ella did not move away, her face pale yet steady, her breath even though her heart pounded against her ribs. The silence that fell in that instant was louder than the shouts had been. Every eye in the diner fixed on the young woman who stood exposed in front of the weapon. The robber barked at her to hand over everything she had, his voice shaking with the edge of nerves, and she nodded once, slow and calm, as though she had expected this moment. Her hand slid into the pocket of her apron, fingers closing around the wad of bills she had collected through the evening. They were damp with sweat, the corners curled, tips gathered from tables she had served with tired patience, money she needed for rent and groceries, and the endless cycle of bills that never seemed to end. She pulled them free and held them out with both hands, her arms steady though her knuckles whitened from the grip. The robber snatched the crumpled notes, stuffing them into his jacket, but his gaze lingered on her, perhaps unsettled by her lack of fear, perhaps unwilling to admit that her quiet composure disarmed him more than his gun could ever disarm her. The room was frozen, time stretching thin, the only sounds the faint hiss of the kitchen grill and the shallow breathing of dozens of people pressed low against their seats. Alexander watched from his booth, his eyes narrowed, his mind capturing every detail, the way her chin lifted just slightly as the gun hovered inches from her chest, the way her lips pressed together but never trembled. She had given up her night's wages, every dollar she had worked for, without protest, not because she was weak, but because she valued the lives around her more than her own comfort. A woman near the counter let out a sob and whispered that she was brave. A man ducked behind a chair whispered that she was mad. But all of them watched her as though she had done something extraordinary. To face a weapon without flinching was more than courage. It was defiance, the kind that came not from strength, but from a refusal to let fear dictate her choices. The robber lowered the gun a fraction, unsettled, before turning to bark more orders. But the impression lingered. Ella stood tall again, her eyes sweeping the room, offering silent assurance to those who needed it most. Alexander felt a surge of respect move through him like a current, sharp and undeniable. In a single act, with crumpled bills clutched in her hands, Ella Marlowe had shown the entire diner that dignity could exist even under the shadow of a gun, and the silence that followed was heavy with awe and fear in equal measure. Alexander sat motionless in his booth, his fingers curled around the rim of his coffee cup, his gaze fixed on Ella as she moved back toward the counter with steps that looked ordinary but carried a quiet purpose. The robbers were still shouting, one sweeping his gun across the room as if daring anyone to test him, another gathering up wallets and watches in a greasy fast food bag. But Ella seemed to glide past them, her expression calm, her eyes lowered in a way that made her appear harmless. To anyone else, it looked like she was doing exactly as she had been told. But Alexander noticed the subtle shift in her pace, the way her hand brushed against the edge of the counter for just a moment too long. From where he sat, he could see the faint glow of a screen under her palm, the tiny square of light hidden by her body, and he realized she was holding a phone. Not hers, perhaps. Maybe one left by a busboy or stashed near the register. But it was there. And her thumb moved with careful precision across the glass. She pressed a sequence, not dialing a number but tapping in what he recognized as an emergency code, the kind pre-programmed to send an alert without the need for words. Her hand shielded the action as though she were merely steadying herself, her shoulders relaxed, her breath even. The brilliance of it struck him at once. She was buying time, creating a lifeline without drawing attention, risking everything in those few seconds. If the robber nearest to her turned, if he noticed the faint glow beneath her hand, it would be over. Yet she did not rush, did not let her nerves betray her. Alexander felt the pulse in his throat quicken, admiration blooming in a place he had not expected. This was intelligence under pressure, the kind of quick decision-making he demanded of his top executives, yet none of them had ever faced a loaded gun while performing it. She slid the phone further under the counter, dimming the screen until it was swallowed by shadow, her movement so natural that no one noticed. Then she straightened, hands visible once more, her expression unchanging, and she stepped back toward the center of the room as if nothing had happened. The robbers kept barking, their focus still on the valuables piling up, and the diners around her remained hunched and silent, unaware that help was already on its way because of one waitress's steady courage. Alexander leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving her, his chest tightening with a rare sense of pride that had nothing to do with himself. He had built skyscrapers and companies, amassed wealth that stretched beyond comprehension. Yet here was a young woman in a frayed uniform, showing him what true worth looked like. She had not hesitated, she had not panicked, and she had risked discovery in the most dangerous of moments for the sake of everyone around her. He marveled not just at her composure, but at her instinct, her ability to see past her own fear and act with quiet brilliance. And he knew then that Ella Marlowe was no ordinary waitress. The robbers had nearly finished sweeping through the diner, their bag bulging with wallets, watches, and trembling hands still lifting jewelry into the pile, when a new voice cracked through the air. It was higher, desperate, carrying a note of false bravado. The restaurant manager, a man in his 40s with slicked hair and a gold chain at his collar, stumbled out from behind the counter where he had been crouching, his hands lifted in surrender, his words tumbling over each other. "Wait, wait, don't hurt me," he said, his tone eager and trembling. "There's more. I can get you more. Just let me show you." The leader of the masked men turned his head sharply, suspicion flashing in his eyes. The room grew still again, every diner's breath caught, as the manager took another step forward, his palms out like an eager salesman. "There's a safe in the back," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own fear. "Cash, plenty of it, more than you'll get from them. I can open it for you." His eyes darted quickly toward the terrified guests huddled on the floor, and then back to the men with guns. "Spare me. Let me walk out of this, and I'll make it worth your time." Alexander, still a shadow in his booth, felt his stomach tighten as he watched. The cowardice was plain, the willingness to sacrifice others to save himself written across the man's sweat-slick face. It was a kind of betrayal that Alexander had seen before in boardrooms when pressure mounted. Men who would sell out their colleagues to protect their own skin. Men who confused survival with dishonor. Here, in this small diner, it revealed itself again in a man meant to lead his staff, but who crumbled at the first sign of danger. Ella saw it, too. She had been guiding a frightened child further under a booth when the manager's words struck her ears, and her head snapped up. Her face shifted, not into open anger, but into a hard, quiet disappointment that was somehow more damning. She had risked herself to calm others, had used her voice to steady strangers, and yet the man paid to protect his employees had rushed to barter away his loyalty. Her eyes locked on him across the room, and though she said nothing, the look was enough. The robbers conferred quickly, one shoving the manager toward the hallway that led to the office. The man stumbled ahead eagerly, his fear masked as obedience, his greed hidden in promises of more cash. Guests shrank back as he passed, their expressions mixed with disbelief and disgust. But he did not look at them. Alexander noted the contrast, the manager's craven eagerness beside Ella's unshaken poise, the difference between self-preservation at any cost and dignity held even under threat of death. As the office door slammed shut behind them, silence filled the diner once more. Alexander sat still, his jaw tight, knowing he had just witnessed the measure of two souls laid bare. Ella's strength and the manager's betrayal stood in stark relief, and he felt the truth settle deep inside him. The minutes dragged like hours as the robbers barked orders, their guns sweeping the room, their tempers growing sharper with each passing second. The manager had vanished into the back with one of them, leaving two in the dining area, their restlessness clear in every twitch of their hands. The guests huddled low, trembling, but the air was shifting, heavy with the dread that something violent was about to spark. In the middle of it all, Ella rose slowly from where she had been crouching near a family, her hands raised just high enough to show she meant no harm. She took a step forward, placing herself directly in the line of sight between the robbers and the cluster of diners pressed against the wall. Her calm drew their attention at once. One snarled at her to sit back down, the gun jerking toward her chest, but she did not retreat. Her voice, when it came, was steady, soft but clear, carrying enough weight to cut through the noise. "Look at me," she said, keeping her tone low and even. "Don't look at them. They're not your problem. You want money? You've already got plenty, so take it and go. No one here wants trouble." It was a dangerous gamble, but it worked. The robber's eyes fixed on her instead of the terrified mother behind her. His focus narrowed to the woman who refused to shrink. She shifted her weight slightly, her stance protective, creating a fragile barrier of flesh and bone, but one that carried the strength of intent. The other guests clung to her composure like a lifeline, their sobs quieting, their panic softening into something closer to stillness. She was distracting the danger, pulling it onto herself, and in doing so, she was giving the police outside, who must surely be closing in by now, precious minutes to prepare. From his booth, Alexander watched with a sharp, almost painful clarity. He had seen executives falter when negotiations turned hostile, had seen men with degrees and titles sweat under pressure that was nothing compared to this. Yet Ella stood her ground with a presence that rivaled the strongest leaders he had ever known. She had no power, no wealth, no authority beyond her uniform and her voice, and still she held the room together. Her eyes never wavered, her hands did not tremble, and her words, though simple, had a precision that redirected fear into focus. The robber closest to her cursed under his breath, pacing a step to the left, unsettled by her calm. He waved his gun, demanding silence from the crowd, but they were already silent, all eyes on Ella. Alexander leaned forward slightly, the disguise of an ordinary man allowing him to witness something extraordinary. In that moment he knew he was not just watching survival, he was watching leadership in its purest form, unpolished, untrained, yet undeniable. The turning point had come, not with violence, but with the quiet strength of a waitress who chose to stand when everyone else had sunk to the ground. The first wail of a siren was faint. Barely a thread of sound carried through the night air, but it landed inside the diner like a spark in dry tinder. Heads lifted from where they had been pressed to the floor, hope flickering in wide, frightened eyes, and the robbers stiffened at once, their bodies snapping with tension. The leader cursed, his voice rising as he barked at his partner to move faster, to get everything and get out. The sound grew louder with each passing second, the long, mournful cry of police cars drawing closer, a promise of rescue to the hostages, and a warning of doom to the men holding the guns. Panic flashed across the face of the youngest robber, his weapon shaking as he scanned the room, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. "They're coming!" he shouted, his words cracking with fear. "We're out of time!" The leader spun on him, eyes wild behind the mask, and roared at him to shut up, but the moment of fracture was already there, a crack splitting their control. That was when one of them lunged for Ella. His hand gripped her arm hard enough to bruise, yanking her close, his gun pressing against her temple as he dragged her into his chest. The room erupted with cries, people screaming for him to let her go, but the robber snarled for silence, his voice high with desperation. "Nobody moves," he shouted. "Nobody, or she dies." Ella stumbled against his hold, her face still pale but her body held straight, her eyes scanning the room not with fear, but with the sharp focus of someone who understood that everything hung on staying calm. She raised her hands slightly, showing she would not resist, her voice steady though low as she told the people watching to stay down, to stay quiet. Alexander's body tensed in his booth, every instinct in him flaring awake. He had remained still through it all, letting his disguise keep him invisible, but as he watched the gun pressed to Ella's head, something primal stirred inside him. His mind sharpened, stripping away the disguise, the tired jacket and scuffed boots falling away in his own awareness, until only the man of decisions remained. He calculated the distance, the angles, the odds of disarming versus waiting, the consequences of a misstep. His instincts screamed at him to act, to stand and end it, but his reason, honed from years of battles not with guns but with power, told him to wait. Timing would be everything. The sirens swelled, red and blue lights beginning to dance against the diner windows, washing across the terrified faces crouched low in the booths. The robbers cursed again, the leader pacing near the door, his grip on control unraveling by the second. Alexander leaned forward, eyes locked on Ella, watching her hold her ground even in the arms of danger, and he knew that when the moment came, he would be ready. He would not remain invisible forever. The red and blue lights strobed through the diner windows, spilling across the walls in sharp flashes as the doors burst open and officers poured inside, their weapons drawn, their voices booming commands that collided with the already fractured noise. The robbers froze for a heartbeat, torn between fight and flight, and the one clutching Ella pulled her tighter, his gun digging into her temple as he shouted that he would shoot if anyone moved. The officers fanned out, their own shouts rising, demanding the men drop their weapons, promising mercy if they complied, threatening death if they did not. The air was electric, every breath shallow, every second stretched to breaking. In the center of the room, Ella stood rigid in the grip of her captor, her face pale but her eyes steady, the picture of calm even as the world around her shook. Alexander rose slowly from his booth, no longer content to remain the invisible man in plain clothes. He straightened to his full height, the disguise slipping away not from his clothing but from the weight of his presence. For the first time that night, he allowed the voice that had swayed boardrooms and bent rivals to his will to cut through the chaos. It was calm, low and unwavering, carrying a command that seemed to reach past fear itself. "Put the gun down." The words were simple, almost quiet compared to the shouting around him, but something in the tone made the robber falter. His hand twitched, the barrel shifting slightly away from Ella's head, his eyes flicking toward the man who had risen from the shadows of a corner booth. Alexander's voice was not pleading, nor was it desperate. It was the voice of authority, the kind that did not ask but declared, the kind that carried weight without needing to shout. In that moment, he was no longer the unremarkable stranger in worn boots. He was a force, and even masked men with guns could feel it. The leader of the robbers barked at his partner to hold steady, his own weapon raised towards the police, but hesitation had already seeped into their ranks. Ella felt the grip on her loosen by a fraction, her breath catching as she sensed the shift. Alexander stepped closer, his eyes locked on the man with the gun, every inch of him radiating calm control. He repeated the words, softer this time, but no less commanding. "Put it down. You don't want this to end badly." Around them, the police edged forward, their own weapons unwavering, yet none of them had pierced the robber's panic the way Alexander's presence had. Ella's gaze flicked toward him, realization dawning that this man was not who he seemed, that the quiet diner guest carried a strength deeper than any disguise could hide. The robber's chest heaved, his bravado slipping, and for a breathless instant it seemed he might obey. In that suspended moment, Alexander Sterling revealed himself, not by name or wealth, but by the undeniable power of a voice that made even danger hesitate. The moment hung suspended in the air, the robber's arms stiff and trembling as the gun hovered inches from Ella's head, the police frozen in their stances, the entire diner holding its breath as though the world itself had stopped turning. Alexander's calm words still echoed, his presence a weight that seemed to press down harder than the flashing guns or the blaring sirens outside. Ella did not move, her body rigid but her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give the man holding her even the satisfaction of seeing her break. That strength seeped into the air, invisible but powerful, and together with Alexander's steady dominance, it began to unravel the chaos. The robber's grip faltered, sweat dripping down his forehead beneath the mask, his hand shaking more with every second. He looked from Ella's unflinching face to the tall man who had risen from the booth, then to the circle of police waiting with fingers on triggers, and the certainty of his control collapsed in his chest. He cursed, loud but hollow, and his gun dipped, wavering as his bravado cracked. "Don't make me do this," he muttered, but the words had lost their edge. Alexander took a single step closer, his tone even lower now, almost gentle but still threaded with steel. "Then don't. Put it down." The robber's partner by the door glanced at him with panic in his eyes, the pressure of sirens and shouting and fear finally breaking through. One by one, the threads of their resolve snapped, and with a final frustrated cry the young man shoved Ella away from him and let the weapon clatter to the floor. The leader hesitated only a moment longer before dropping his gun as well, his hands shooting into the air with a defeated curse. The sound of metal against tile was like a release, and the officers surged forward, disarming the men with swift precision, forcing them to the ground and locking cold cuffs around their wrists. The guests, who had been crouched and silent, erupted in gasps and sobs, tears spilling as the terror drained out of them all at once. Some clung to one another, some pressed their hands over their mouths, some laughed in disbelief at still being alive. The noise of relief filled every corner of the diner, raw and overwhelming, but in the center of it Ella stood upright, her chest heaving, her composure finally cracking into a shimmer of tears that she quickly brushed away. Applause began hesitantly, a pair of hands clapping from the far booth, then more joining in, until the sound swelled across the room. It was not for the police, though their presence had been crucial. It was for the young waitress who had refused to collapse under fear, and for the man whose calm words had steadied even the hands of criminals. Alexander inclined his head slightly, accepting none of it but recognizing all of it, while Ella lowered her gaze, humbled yet shining with a quiet dignity that no uniform or disguise could hide. The diner slowly emptied under the firm direction of the officers, their voices calm now but still carrying authority as they guided the shaken guests towards the doors. Mothers clutched children tightly, couples leaned into one another for support. Elderly men and women shuffled with wide eyes and trembling hands, each step out into the cool night air, feeling like a return from the edge of something terrible. The sirens continued to wail outside, echoing against the buildings, the red and blue lights flashing across the glass as if to erase the shadows that had nearly claimed the room. The robbers were already in custody, their masks pulled away, their eyes downcast as they were shoved into waiting cars. The danger was over, but the weight of it still lingered heavy in the air. Ella stood near the counter, speaking quietly to a young girl who had been separated from her parents in the chaos, her hand resting gently on the child's shoulder until the family was reunited. Her uniform was rumpled, her hair falling loose from its tie, and her face pale from the strain. Yet her calm never wavered. She spoke with the same steady tone she had used during the robbery, soothing those still shaking, offering water to those whose voices cracked with exhaustion. The other staff watched her as though she had become something greater than herself, as though the ordinary waitress who had walked in for her shift hours ago had transformed before their eyes into the protector they had needed most. Alexander remained in his booth until the flow of people moving past had thinned, until the officer's focus was no longer on the guests, but on statements and evidence. Then, quietly, he rose, his jacket falling back into place around him, the disguise once again complete. He slipped toward the door without drawing attention, his steps quick but not hurried, his head lowered as though he were just another patron eager to escape the memory of what had happened inside. No one stopped him, no one recognized him, and in that anonymity he found the strange freedom he always sought. Yet tonight it did not feel like relief. Tonight it felt like a burden. The cool air hit him as he stepped outside, sharp with the tang of exhaust and rain, the city alive with flashing lights and murmurs of onlookers gathering at the edges. He pulled his collar higher and walked a short distance down the street until he reached a darker stretch away from the crowd. There, he paused, leaning against the rough brick of a closed storefront, his breath clouding faintly in the night. His mind burned with the memory of what he had seen. Not the guns, not the fear, not even the moment of surrender. What stayed with him was Ella, standing firm in the face of terror, guiding strangers with nothing but her voice and her resolve. He thought of the executives who filled the boardrooms of Sterling Global, men and women paid millions to make decisions under pressure, to lead in times of uncertainty. He had watched many of them falter, seen them hesitate, seen them crumble when the stakes rose. Yet here was a waitress in frayed clothes who had outshone them all without title or training, leading with instinct and courage that could not be bought. As the sirens faded into the distance, Alexander knew this night had changed something in him, though he could not yet name what it would mean. Morning light spilled across the polished glass front of the diner, a softer glow than the frantic flashes of sirens that had lit it only hours before. The doors opened quietly, and Alexander Sterling stepped inside, no longer dressed in worn boots and a faded jacket, but in a dark, tailored suit that carried the weight of his true identity. The atmosphere was calmer now, only a few scattered customers finishing breakfast plates, the clink of cutlery faint compared to the chaos of the night before. Yet the moment he entered, the room shifted. Conversations faltered, forks hovered in mid-air, and the staff froze where they stood as though a sudden frost had touched them. The hostess who had dismissed him the night before stared openly, her words drying in her throat as recognition spread across her face. The manager was absent, having been taken away in shame and handcuffs. But the rest of the team remained, eyes wide as they realized the man who had blended into a booth as a stranger was in fact their employer, the reclusive billionaire who owned the very company that signed their checks. Whispers rose at once, low and awed, his name passing from one mouth to another like a rumor turned real. Alexander's gaze swept across the room, but he ignored the stares, his eyes fixed on the counter where Ella stood, wiping down a tray. Her hands faltered when she looked up and saw him, her body tensing with disbelief. She had spoken to him as a nobody, guided him through the chaos as if he were just another customer, never knowing the weight of the man she was helping. Now she stood frozen, her eyes wide, her mouth parting slightly as though she wanted to speak but could not find words. He walked with unhurried steps, each one heavy with authority, until he stood before her. The staff gathered in the background, their faces pale, unsure whether to bow their heads or hold their breath. Alexander removed his gloves and placed them neatly on the counter, his movements deliberate, his voice calm, yet commanding when he finally spoke. "Good morning," he said, and though the words were simple, they landed with the power of a declaration. Ella swallowed hard, her eyes flicking to the floor before rising again. "Good morning, sir," she managed, her voice quiet but steady. Alexander studied her closely, seeing not the nervous waitress she thought she was in this moment, but the woman he had seen stand firm against guns, the one who had commanded calm in a room on the edge of breaking. Around them, the silence grew thick, the staff waiting for judgment, waiting for consequence, waiting for the kind of verdict that could change their futures with a single word. Alexander let the pause linger, savoring the control of it, then finally inclined his head. "You did well last night," he said. Relief washed across the room, breaths released in unison, but the words were for Ella alone, and she knew it. The diner had emptied by midday, leaving only the low hum of the refrigerators and the faint clatter of dishes being stacked in the back. Alexander sat at a corner table, this time not as a stranger, but as himself, a man whose presence filled the room without needing introduction. Ella stood across from him, her apron folded neatly on the counter, her hands clasped in front of her as though holding them together might steady the nervous energy running through her. She had agreed to sit, though it was clear she felt out of place, her eyes darting to the floor and back to his face, unsure what kind of conversation awaited her. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his tone softer than his posture, and asked her about herself. Not about last night, but about her life beyond the uniform. She hesitated at first, the instinct of someone used to keeping her burdens quiet, but under his steady gaze she began to speak. Her voice was low but clear, and as the words came, Alexander listened with the patience of a man who had built his empire by paying attention to details others ignored. She told him about her mother, widowed when Ella was still a teenager, left to raise 2 children on a waitress's wages, and the thin hope of making it through each month. Ella had stepped into the role of support without complaint, taking her first job at 16, and by the time she turned 24, she was the backbone of her family. Her younger brother was still in school, a boy with a sharp mind and a future she wanted to protect, and every dollar she earned went to ensure he never felt the full weight of their struggles. The diner was not her only job. She worked mornings at a small cafe across town, afternoons here, and nights bent over textbooks in a cramped apartment she shared with her mother and brother. Criminology was her chosen field, a subject she studied with determination long after her shifts ended, fueled by an unshakable belief that justice mattered, that people needed someone willing to stand for them. The courage she had shown the night before was not luck, not chance, but the result of years spent carrying responsibilities far heavier than her own frame should have borne. Alexander absorbed every word, his chest tightening with a respect that surprised him. He had thought her bravery came from instinct, a rare and precious quality, but now he saw it was deeper. It was forged by necessity, by nights spent exhausted but unyielding, by mornings that began before the sun, and by dreams that refused to die even under the weight of endless work. She had not been fearless last night, but she had been steady, and that steadiness was the product of a life that had demanded nothing less. When she finished speaking, she looked away, almost ashamed of how much she had revealed. Alexander remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on her, realizing that the truth about Ella Marlowe was far more extraordinary than he had imagined. The afternoon crowd had not yet arrived, leaving the diner in a rare hush, only the scrape of chairs and the faint buzz of lights filling the space. The staff gathered near the counter, their faces still etched with exhaustion from the night before, each of them whispering to one another as Alexander Sterling stood in the middle of the room. His presence commanded silence without effort, the tailored suit marking him as a man of wealth and power, but his eyes, fixed on Ella, carried something deeper than authority. He had asked them all to stay, and now they waited, uncertain of what was coming, the weight of his reputation pressing against their nerves. Ella stood among them, her hands clasped in front of her apron, her cheeks pale as though she wanted to fade into the background. She had not asked for recognition, had not sought out gratitude, but every person in that room knew what she had done. Alexander let the quiet linger before he spoke, his voice calm and measured, yet carrying the same authority that had cut through the chaos of the robbery. He began not with criticism, not with judgment, but with praise. He told them how he had witnessed composure when fear threatened to break everyone, how he had seen a voice steady the room when guns had been drawn, and how that voice belonged not to a manager or a leader by title, but to a waitress who had stood unflinching in the face of danger. Every pair of eyes turned to Ella, and she lowered her gaze, her throat tightening with embarrassment. Alexander stepped closer, his words sharpening into clarity. He declared that Ella Marlowe had shown more leadership in one night than many of the executives seated in his corporate boardrooms had managed in years. The staff gasped softly at the revelation, some exchanging startled glances as his identity and authority became fully undeniable. Then he shifted from praise to action. He announced that whatever debts hung over Ella's head, whether medical, educational, or personal, would be erased in full under his name. Her mother's endless struggle, her brother's needs, her own sacrifices, all would be lifted from her shoulders. Ella blinked rapidly, her hands trembling, her voice failing as she tried to form a response. Before she could speak, Alexander continued, his tone firm yet warm. He told her that her education would be fully funded, every class, every book, every cost paid for by Sterling Global, because a mind and spirit like hers deserved not exhaustion, but opportunity. And finally, he offered her something that silenced the room entirely, a position within his company, not as a token gesture, but as the foundation of a new division dedicated to security and ethics, a place where she would oversee the welfare of employees and the integrity of systems, answering directly to him. Tears welled in Ella's eyes as the magnitude of his words washed over her. Around her, the staff stood in stunned silence, watching the transformation of a tired waitress into something entirely new. Alexander did not smile, did not soften the weight of the moment, but his voice carried certainty when he said, "You've earned this. The world needs more people like you." The room was silent, the weight of Alexander's words hanging in the air like something sacred, every staff member waiting to see what Ella would do. She stood frozen, her hands clasped so tightly they ached, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths as she tried to make sense of what had just been offered to her. Her debts erased, her education funded, a position in a company so vast it touched every corner of the city. It was more than she had ever dared to dream, more than she had even allowed herself to imagine during the long nights spent wiping counters and studying at the kitchen table by a single lamp. Her eyes filled with tears she could not blink away, and when she finally found her voice, it came out in a whisper so soft it barely carried. "Yes," she said, her lips trembling. "I accept." The sound of those words was like a release, and the staff around her exhaled as if they had been holding their breath. A few clapped hesitantly, others smiled through their disbelief, and still others wiped their eyes. But Ella stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed by the sudden shift of her world. She had walked into her shift a waitress, weighed down by bills and responsibilities, and now she was leaving as something far greater. A woman given the chance to build a future not just for herself, but for her family. She pressed her hands to her face for a moment, trying to hold back the flood of emotion, then lowered them again, her gaze meeting Alexander's. Gratitude filled her eyes, but so did determination, as if she already understood the responsibility that came with his gift. Alexander looked at her, his expression steady, but his mind burning with reflection. He had built towers of glass and steel, commanded armies of employees, and shaped markets with the flick of a pen. His wealth had bought him everything: cars, jets, homes, and influence that reached across continents. Yet none of it had ever given him the feeling he carried now, standing in a small diner surrounded by ordinary people, watching a young woman's life change because of her courage. He realized then that money could build empires, but it could never buy the raw strength of character, the kind that stood in front of guns and calmed a room with nothing but steady words. That truth humbled him more than any victory he had claimed in the business world. Ella wiped her cheeks and stood taller, her voice gaining strength as she thanked him, her tone filled with both wonder and resolve. The staff erupted into applause, genuine this time, their hands clapping not for the billionaire in the suit, but for the waitress who had become a symbol of dignity in the face of fear. Alexander let the sound wash over him, a reminder that legacies were not written in profits or skyscrapers, but in moments like this, when character shone brighter than wealth. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.